Hey guys, before we get going, if you use trading apps, you got to check out eToro. It's a good way to gain exposure to Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies while still getting your fix with the more traditional assets that you might know more about or just want more exposure to. eToro is also a social trading platform, which means it's kind of like social media and trading together. With copy trading, you can copy or just sort of adapt to the trading strategies of some of the best traders worldwide on the platform. This is not only going to give you exposure to how people are buying Bitcoin, but it's also going to show you what people are doing when they're expecting downturns or, one of those bull runs. So head over to eToro.com to get started on your 2020 portfolio today. eToro, smart crypto trading made easy. Welcome. What's up, everybody? Dave Hollerith here. This is the Bitcoin Magazine podcast, and that means it's a show that focuses on the tech, political, and social happenings around Bitcoin. Some of you may or may not know, we at Bitcoin Magazine also dedicate a fair chunk of time to covering the Darknet. Some of Bitcoin's most well-known and early use cases occurred on the Darknet. I'm talking about things like WikiLeaks and everything on Silk Road. For beginners, these marketplaces are not completely anonymous, but they are a lot more private than anything we use on the ClearNet. Also, this extra layer of anonymity presents an interesting and obvious problem when trying to make commercial transactions. How can you trust anybody? And it's true, there's tons of scams in this area, but actually trust builds on these anonymous marketplaces. Before something like that happens, there's a huge opportunity for scams. On today's episode, I'm stoked to present you a darker story about the hoax and reality of one of the nichest scam markets happening on the internet today. Murder for hire or assassination marketplaces have been embedded in the urban legends and rumors surrounding the dark web for at least a decade. And the best coverage of this topic I read over the last few years has come from a long-form piece by Brian Merchant. Click here to kill. This episode, I'm talking with Brian about his piece, how he got involved following a story around the murder for hire scams, and also the history and darker reality of what this kind of marketplace is. I'm attaching Brian's piece in our show notes, and I definitely encourage you to read it before listening to this interview. The rest of this episode is very dark, and if you don't want to hear about murder plots, real and fake, I'd suggest you skip this episode. Here's my interview with Brian Merchant. Hey, Brian. Thanks for coming on.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Dave.
So the focus of the conversation is click here to kill. I think you did a fantastic job with it. And it follows real incidences of people who are impacted by these murder for hire darknet markets. Our audience is fairly acquainted with darknet markets. So murder for hire is not really a shock. I think a lot of people just don't actually know a ton about it. So in your story, there's a girl, Alexis Stern, a high schooler. She has a fairly normal life. Ironically, she self-publishes sci-fi novels that are sort of like thrillers. And then her life is like completely upended when she finds out that somebody has placed a $5,000 hit on her through a darknet murder for hire service. Starting from there, can you fill in some of those gaps? Like, when and where did you get involved in the story?
Yeah. So I started covering this general space when I was at Vice, maybe 5-6 years ago at this point now. Some of your listeners and readers will surely remember when, as a stunt, sort of a anonymous developer built a version of the assassination market that Jim Bell, who we'll probably talk about in a little bit, imagined way back in the 90s. He used a pseudonym, and he made basically a murder for hire sort of crowdsourcing where you could ostensibly pay Bitcoin to have Ben Bernanke, Barack Obama killed. And it was pretty clearly a stunt, and it made some headlines. And it was sort of, the occasional kind of, emergence of one of these murder markets in the press that gets talked about, and about why the dark web is so scary, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But this particular one was interesting because of that parallel to the early web history of Jim Bell, this guy who was a cypherpunk who had concocted this thought experiment basically in the mid 90s, when sort of some of the earliest thought experiments and sort of math was being done around cryptocurrency. It wasn't a real thing yet in any meaningful sense, but it was articles were showing up in Scientific American. The proof of concept of a encrypted sort of distributed currency was beginning to emerge. And this guy named Jim Bell, who was an Intel engineer, who was also sort of this avowed crypto anarchist, basically
a cypherpunk, essentially.
He was a cypher. Yeah, he wasn't one of the original sort of cypher, but he did get added to the list. And he was kind of a fringe figure in the cypherpunks community, which was already kind of viewed sometimes, depending on where you sat, as kind of a fringe group.
Yeah.
But so his idea was, again, assassination politics. It was this essay that he outlined and published online, and then it was distributed on the cypherpunks mailing list. Was basically you could have a system where once cryptocurrency is available, you could basically have a crowdsourced market where people could nominate government figures. He was anti-government, thought the government was corrupt without exception. So any public figure that wronged its constituents would be up for being added to this list. You would then use your cryptocurrency to sort of make these betting pools, and you'd say, like, I want X dead, and you'd donate your amount and the amounts would rise. And the real innovation was that if you had an encrypted means of paying for something, then the two parties would never have to meet the person. So what you would do, you would pledge a prediction on the other side. If you said, oh look, the governor of Indiana the bounty has risen to $100,000 worth of cryptocurrency, that's interesting. And the other side, you would make a quote unquote prediction as to when that person would die. You would register that prediction, and then if it came to pass and the person was indeed dead on that day and it was correct, there would be a hash that would sort of unlock that connection and make that payment. And you would basically automatically get those funds. You would never have to meet any of the people that made the quote unquote bet. And of course, the only way that when somebody's going to die to be certain by the day is that you would do it yourself. So it's basically this prediction market for assassinations. And he got a lot of heat from the authorities because that kind of thing, these kind of thinking and these like more disturbing ideas and philosophies are commonplace now. But back in the 90s, the web was still new. People were still kind of very uneasy about very many things online, and so this seemed particularly dark or disturbing to the authorities, who then really kind of tailed him. And he, don't want to go too far down the Jim Bell lane, but it was he basically spent 10 years plus in prison, partly because he didn't pay his taxes and he broke some real laws, but also because he was spooking the powers that be, basically, and the FBI was indeed tailing him, and he sort of looked up information about them on a public database, and it was the flimsiest charges, really, but it violated his parole, and the judge sent him away for 10 years. So basically, he became this dark figure who's kind of animated a lot of discussions about some of the more sketchy uses for cryptocurrency on the dark web. And people have made these, they've either used his ideas to sort of undergird their hoaxes. So that's basically where it comes into this story. He plants this idea that on the dark web, assassination can happen. You can hire, killers. You can you know, through various means, and you know, hoaxsters and scammers then sort of take advantage of this idea, and plus sort of the alarmism of the media. So over the next, you know, 20 years, you see some of these things pop up from time to time. They're either stunts or they're hoaxes or they're grifts. And in the case of this story, I started following this stunt, and I started looking around as to what else was out there, and I found some strange occurrences having to do with the one market that was really seemed like it was putting an effort into appearing real, had a payment system that was designed to like accept money. It looked like there was like a menu that you could choose how you, so it looked, and there had been sort of cases of money changing hands here. And this was originally called Besa Mafia, and then it would change names every so often as people exposed it for a hoax. But I found this one, and I became really interested in the story of all the people that it sort of, who had come into contact with it. And it's always bad news.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of like an assassination market, that's just sort of taking a derivative of like the most extreme outcome of a prediction market, which prediction markets are, you know, they're talked about frequently. And I don't know if I've really seen it like a successful, like decentralized prediction market yet, but
Right. Augers, isn't Augur trying to do it? And
yeah.
I mean, there's just no money really on them. And I think feels like a lot of things need to happen to like instill confidence in the system, which, you know, is, if you're ever going to have an actual assassination market, the one thing you would be worried about is whether or not people had confidence in it. Because that's the thing, is that they've all been silly or hoaxes or dumb until, you know, thus far, you know, but, you know, they're obviously capable of being built, right? They're obviously sort of, the technical difficulties of making these are not extreme. It's just, you know, a matter of whether or not there's any confidence in the market, and they're in any of these such markets. And of course there's not, with good reason.
Yeah. So how did you find out about Alexis Stern?
When I started researching this Besa Mafia thing, which it turned out to be really interesting, because this hacker, this sort of white hat hacker, and his friend had hacked into its back end, and they had basically access to all the people who were actually buying hits or paying this scammer to place a hit. Which, of course, if you're paying some guy on the dark web $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 to kill somebody, that's a pretty good indication that that person is in legitimate danger. Like, the website itself is a hoax, but the person paying that kind of money, you know, is obviously serious about having this happen. So I had started going down the list of just everybody who this hacker, Chris Montero, had sort of organized the data into a wiki, and he had basically logged all of the conversations and transactions that were happening on this site. So I was just kind of working my way down. So Chris Montero had been going to the FBI with this information, asking them to sort of look in on these. Previously, another hacker had kind of released some of the very earliest logs, and the FBI had done a cursory kind of look into some of these people, it seems like, but it was unclear as to whether the people on this kill list had actually been contacted, because that's what it was. It's a kill list. It's like one of the most horrifying documents I've ever read, even though it's fictional. It like exists in this sort of purgatory, you know, where it's really hard to decipher intent. Is this guy serious? Is he, you know, does he want to kill his wife, or is he just blowing off steam? Sometimes the dollar amount helps, like, oh, this guy put down $5 because he wanted to sort of hire this guy to kill his stepmom.
Like, it's a joke.
And it's like, oh, like, okay. And it turns out, that guy, by the way, ended up going to jail for 3 years. And some of these other guys have not ever been caught. So it's sort of a wasteland, and it was a difficult story to report for that, because sometimes you're laughing at how absurd some of these requests and interactions are. I detail a couple of them in the piece. Some
Yeah.
I didn't go into. There's one I'll just because this didn't make it into the piece, but I pushed for it because it's like so absurd. It's like the sort of the modern day digital Fargo kind of, like, real killers, real bad ideas, real comedy. Like, it's just hard to untangle some of it. But there's this one case where this woman, we believe it's a woman, was trying to have her ex-husband killed, and she had paid $5,000. And Yura, who's the name of the site administrator, the hoaxer, especially in the early days, would pretend that he was a real killer. He would, like, he would interact, or not a real killer, but a real a hire, a real sort of mafioso who was dispatching these killers. So he would play the part in these chats, and he would say, like, okay, I need $5,000 more to get these guys to do it. They're in place. They just need more equipment. And she said, well, I've already given you $5,000. You need to prove to me that these guys are there waiting at the street corner I told you to wait at, because he drives by the street corner every day, and you can shoot him then as he pulls up. And and Yura, the hoax guy, says, oh, well, like, okay, so I need more money. And she says, prove it. And he says, okay, here. And he takes a screenshot of Google Street View at the corner with his I'm assuming his finger photoshopped into the picture. So he's like pointing at the intersection that's supposed to be proof that there's a real killer waiting there.
Yeah.
And she's like, this is obviously your finger photoshopped into Google Street View. I'm not giving you $5,000 more. Meanwhile, she's completely serious about having this guy murder her husband or her ex-husband. It's just totally insane, the space that this interaction occupies. But so I was going down the list. I contacted that guy who did not believe me or did not want to talk to me. I was like, somebody wants you dead. And he said, let him come for me or whatever. I don't know. It was just totally. So I was going down that list, and I found Alexis that way. Alexis was on this list. She was one of these names. Someone had paid $5,000 to have her killed. And the FBI had contacted her local police department, who had contacted her. She was 18 years old, just turned 18, just graduated high school, does not necessarily know the intricacies of sort of dark web, mechanics, or whether or not she's actually in any danger, has spent the last 2 years living in fear because somebody wants her dead for real. And the police have not been well equipped enough to the other agencies. DHS and FBI have been involved, but they haven't been able to act in any way to meaningfully sort of push back against this. So she's just basically been living in fear. And really the story is about this emerging paradigm where, even if such a thing is not real, I think the modes in which we're going to be able to inflict severe, I guess, psychic damage is going to increase, whether it's with these markets or with whatever else. But it again, this is something that falls between the cracks of what law enforcement's jurisdiction, maybe even reality itself. It's who knows whether or not she's still in real danger. I would argue that she is, but the story is all about trying to figure out who used this market, what can be done to sort of exercise a little bit of oversight over these things. Like, who can act? How do we stop this grotesque sort of apparatus from, and how do we use it? How do we use it to our advantage? So 2 people on the list have been killed.
Really?
2 people, yeah. One person on the kill list was killed by her husband, and it has been determined conclusively that her husband was the one who put the hit out. He paid out of $5,000 or $6,000 to Europe. He brainstormed all kinds of ways that he wanted to see her dead. Maybe you could burn the house down while don't kill the husband, don't kill the son, because they're good people, and don't. And he was pretending to be some aggrieved competitor. She had like a pet grooming business or something, and he got fed up after months of inaction. Obviously, the scammer just took his money. And the FBI did come by. They were super sloppy about it. They completely ignored the fact that statistically, a domestic partner is the most liable to, do violence to a partner. And they came and they sat both of them down at the same time and said, "Oh, well, we know somebody wants you dead. Are you aware of this?" And they both said, "Oh my God, no." And they bought a gun for protection, and then he killed her with it.
Oh, Jesus.
Yeah, and the son discovered the body. I mean, this guy, total. When you think of a psychopath, this guy is a total psychopath.
He was like the leader of a church, wasn't he?
He was like the elder in it's this extreme church, which may or may not have something to do with why he did this. Is he was starting to have affairs on Ashley Madison, and this church is super strict. No divorce is allowed. So I guess he decided that she had to die, and they in the investigation they happened upon this hard drive. He was actually an IT guy also. He made his living by being an IT guy, and on the hard disk they found the evidence of the Bitcoin transaction, and they were able to match the code, the hash that was on his hard drive with the one that was recorded on the logs that Chris Montero had hacked. So they sort of coincidentally, they weren't looking for him using Montero's logs. They found this data on his computer, and they were aware, I guess, that this person had been sort of threatened. So they were able to put it together that way. And then the other one was a guy who his death was ruled a suicide. And that's another thing that it seems like you see sometimes, small percentage, people putting themselves on this list in hopes that they'll get somebody to kill them as a form of taking their own life. And some people are not convinced. Like there are, as every case in this, there's bounds and a surfeit of sketchy dimensions that you can go off into. Like in this guy's, his name was Brian Naroji. He was like a party promoter, very young guy, kind of an aspiring Instagram influencer kind of guy who was like big in the party scene apparently, and was also military. And he had, just before his death, there was a young woman who he took out a large life insurance policy and made her the beneficiary. So there's like, the police department is convinced that it was a suicide, but his family is not. So
wow,
lots and lots of grotesquerie. These are obviously the case of the Minnesota couple, and is the worst one. But there are, in terms of what people are asking these imaginary assassins to do, it's just the sky's the limit. It's just as horrifying as you could possibly conceive of.
Yeah. So my first thought when you started describing some of these deaths, my first thought was, this is literally beyond the realm of many imaginations and any kind of reality that anyone's ever heard of. But then I was also thinking, it's also kind of strangely sounds kind of like human nature at its worst, always, going this way, or just has always happened this way. Like these kind of things have always happened. There's just kind of like, there's just sort of the internet as a way to sort of like proliferate these impulses, I guess. What's your take there?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two elements that are worth noting on that. I wouldn't say that, people are suddenly worse or anything. But I would say that having access to these spaces can sort of encourage the worst proclivities to sort of be realized. When you have a space that is, or presumes to be, totally anonymous, uh, promises assassinations, promises killings, promises you a space to make these, you know, these demands and to have this sort of dialogue, then something called like the online disinhibition effect, which is the theory of a guy named David Suler, which is pretty prominent, well established at this point, is just that when you are online, you are interacting with people under the pretense that your identity will never be discovered or that you will not be held accountable, then yes, you are more likely to say worse things, to sort of act out more disturbing fantasies. For the vast majority of people, this is all sort of usually can be, sort of considered almost even healthy. You're sort of getting rid of this stuff. It can be cathartic, it can be whatever, but the question is, does it sort of in some cases tip the scales a little bit, again, this guy, Bo Bridges, who was convicted of hiring a hitman to kill his mother, making a conspiracy to do this. Like, technically he paid somebody $5 to kill his stepmother on the dark web, even though he'd never met him. Could he have just been drunk? And defense argues that he's mentally ill, and it's not really contested that he is. So a mentally ill guy who's angry, drunk, blowing off some steam, now you're given this space. Are you willing to do things that are a little bit are you willing to explore darker spaces? I don't know. That is the question. And the second part is that it's just all recorded. There's a log of all of this behavior. When, I don't know what the previous forum would have been, sort of like a rambling, angry, drunken conversation at a bar to your closest friends. Now we have these spaces that are not interior, and that, it's one another element that is true of the story is that even in this space that is supposed to be like the darkest of the dark web, this totally Wild West, totally like, anonymous and everything, even that the data is all being collected. It's not being collected by a corporation but it's being collected by somebody, and that is it's being recorded, and there's a record and a log of it. So yeah, is it forcing us into these darker spaces, or goading us? Not forcing. Is it goading a small percentage of us into darker spaces, and then is it sort of creating an indelible record of that? Those are the two points that I would raise.
Yeah. Chris Montero, I've followed his work. He's really interesting in this. I mean, he's a total vigilante in how he's acting in this story. And he's also sort of like somebody who's on dark web frequently. He's sort of under the guise of anonymity, and he's sort of being the good guy actor in this. And that's also kind of interesting to me, in that why he was so proactive about it. I mean, I think it's not that difficult to assume that if somebody got a hold of these records, they would want to act on it in some way. But I don't know. I'm curious into what it was like to sort of interact with him.
Yeah, he, I don't know. He's a perplexing fellow in many ways, because I can't imagine doing this. Like I did it for 6 months, seriously. Basically, it took me about, I'd say I did it. The story spanned about a year from pitch to publication, but it was 6 months, I'd say, of serious work. And that 6 months of this material occupying my headspace was almost more than I could bear. It was just it's just it's so deeply unpleasant to have to navigate it at all. I mean, it's it's like spending all of your time on like one of those many faces of death forums from the early, internet days. Like, why would you do this? I mean, obviously he's trying to help people, and he, I think, deserves a lot of credit for trying to do that. And I think he's just been, it's this almost indecipherable kind of issue, because it's like, on the one hand, it is obviously awful. There are people who are probably in real danger. On the other hand, it's almost impossible to get all of these government agencies to take it seriously.
Yeah.
And I think that's the biggest outcome of his work. And that's what, at this point, I mean, I know from conversations with him, that's what he wants. He wants somebody to either sort of agree to work with him in a structured fashion and just do this, like do the work, just take it off. It's not his job. He shouldn't be having to do this. Or at least find some way that he can work through it in a way that's compensated or something. So it's this hard nebulous space, and he doesn't really know what to do. So I think he seemed heartened a little bit that the DHS in the US was seeming to take some of this on. They made a couple arrests based on his evidence, and but whether that'll hold going forward, it's really hard to say. I don't know.
Yeah. So how did you, like, you said you kind of did it for, I mean, the story sort of spanned a year, but there's 6 months where you're like really heavily researching, contacting these people. Did you spend were you like spending all your time on like the dark web, like on a burner computer? Like, what were you doing?
Yeah, I was on the dark web. I was this website. There are a couple other, as I mentioned at the end of the piece, there are a couple incidents that did not take place on Besa Mafia or any of these, but were sort of arranged on more general kind of Russian language marketplaces on the dark web. One in which it looks like it's according to sort of the investigation in Russia and by the BBC journalists who covered it, it seems to be the first confirmed case of sort of this moving from theoretical to real, in which two young men accepted a job to kill a woman, an investigator, a public investigator, no less, completely anonymously on the dark web. They don't know who hired. I mean, she was investigating corruption, and so had a lot of enemies, presumably, but they found the people who pulled the trigger, but they didn't find who made the sale. So that, I think, heralds a more alarming sort of front in this developing kind of phenomenon than Besa Mafia. I mean, Besa Mafia is alarming because it offers you a window into people who are willing to do awful things, and it gives us some evidence that we should act upon. There's no immediate threat posed by that actual institution. It's all from the people who are participating in it.
That makes me think about using Bitcoin to do it too. Doesn't make a ton of sense to me since it's fairly transparent. I don't know if maybe like these people were using mixers. I mean, but yeah. Even then I feel like that's sort of like not, you would think that would be potentially what is getting these people caught.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That's a great point. And that's the people who do know what's up. They do know to like tumble or mix their Bitcoin, so it's less traceable. But you still can subpoena, the exchanges themselves, as I understand it, in a criminal case. So I think in a couple instances they have approached the exchanges, with a warrant and have been able to get information that way. So you can, it is not perfectly untraceable. And again, I think it's another dimension that's worth exploring into how much just like, the illusion of total anonymity sort of makes people feel like they're free to act in these more deranged ways. But in a lot of cases, maybe the anonymity is enough. It's again, a lot of these I'm finding cross state lines, cross country lines. So like in Alexis's case, we think we know who the person is who did it, but he lives in Britain. So you would have to extradite him to try him. And England in particular has been very reluctant to use any of this sort of evidence. They have a complex relationship with Chris Montero, or their NCA, the version of the FBI they have there, has a very contentious relationship with him because they're even more averse to using any evidence gained from hacking or anything like that. So they have been even slower to move their feet on a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, it's strange.
Yeah, it is. And so yeah, to your question about anonymity, it I think it can provide like this shield for people who don't know. A lot of people who find this stuff are buying their first Bitcoin to do these killings. I mean, I can't be sure, but it's sure like there's instructions on how to purchase Bitcoins, where to buy it, where to. Yeah. So it's like most of these people are not like the case of the Minnesota man who killed his wife. So in his case, like he did know what he was doing. He read up enough. He was familiar with the architecture of Bitcoin and exchanges and how to do it and how to send. And I think he did like tumble his Bitcoin. And but a lot of these people are finding this whole marketplace from Google search. And that's how his operation works, is that he would basically have an SEO farm spam out the search terms for like hire a hitman online. So when you Google like how to hire an assassin online or how to hire a hitman on the Darknet, his WordPress site, which was sort of like designed to look like it was like a blog post that was like, don't look at these hitman websites because these ones are for real. And then it had a link to, his hoax. And people would find it that way. And then it was like, well, you need to, download a Tor browser to do this. And then you would go to the webpage and it was like, okay, you're going to need Bitcoin and here's how to buy a Bitcoin. Here's some good exchanges you can use. And it's basically walking people through the steps necessary to participate in the hoax.
One interesting thing you did point out was how like economic downturn or depression lowers the stakes for people who would be willing to partake in a murder for hire service, which is interesting. I mean, that's all crime across the board. It is crazy to think about that too, especially like considering, I think it was Montero in the piece, you quoted him saying sort of the natural tendency of like anonymous markets are that they gain trust over time. And this is like a small niche market, then maybe one of the most niche. I'm sure there's other ones that are probably even weirder, but like, what do you think about future scenarios here?
Yeah. I mean, that's what I think I game it out just a little bit in the piece, but not overwhelmingly so, because it is hard to speculate, and there are a couple avenues that things could go down in which sort of this phenomenon becomes genuinely worrisome. And I think that it's important to underscore that like the fear is not that some like super polished like Hitman R Us website pops up where anybody can kill anybody at any time. It's more going to be more people trying to get into this scammy, slipshod, sort of weird construction where they're either perpetrating a scam or they're hoping to participate in a scam. The point you raised about people being willing to, do more severe crimes for less money is a trend that concerns some criminologists, particularly the one that I spoke to who surveyed hitmen in England and found that the price of life was actually quite cheap in a lot of cases. So the fear becomes that like as people who sort of grow up online, as sort of disinformation sort of scatters our trust in institutions and makes it hard for us to identify which sites are for real, which aren't, you have a lot of young men who are, without opportunity. And then you have cases like that of THC John, who I mentioned in the piece, but don't explore a whole lot. But he's like a would-be hitman who is kind of brought into being by the website, and he's the only one that we know of, because Yura, in fact, when he was sort of in one of his arguments with Chris Montero, they fight because Chris Montero publishes embarrassing things about him on his blog. Then he has to revamp his website, rename it so that people don't Google the name and then immediately read a list of why it's a hoax. So they kind of play whack-a-mole together also. But when they first interacted, he tried to intimidate Chris Montero by having one of the people who had applied to be a hitman on his website. I don't know if I mentioned that. You can apply to be a hitman. This, I think, in the beginning was either illusory and was just sort of meant to give the impression that this was a market with, buyers and sellers of this good, or he had higher aspirations for the site and maybe was willing to give it a whirl. So there's a few dozen people that have applied that, like, they send these bizarre applications, like YouTube videos of themselves like shooting guns in a field saying, look, I can be a hitman, I'll be your next hitman. And this guy, THC John, was one of them. And he said, hey, like, go torch a car and hold up this sign that had Chris Montero's website on it. And he did. And he paid him like a few $100. And that transaction happened because, as he said, when he was found out and it was approached by Chris Montero later, he was told, he kind of broke. He's like, oh, I'm just a broke guy. I'm just trying to make some money. I didn't want to hurt anybody, once it was like he was at risk of being revealed. So men like that are the fear, as sort of in economic desperation and the sort of scattering of trust in internet sort of institutions and online fluency is more kind of diffuse. And I think those two worlds could end up having some more outcomes like this.
Super, super dark topic. And like your sort of humor at the beginning makes a lot of sense. That is like how you cope with stuff like this in like a modern, I have to have like a normal life kind of way. Are you doing any more work like this?
Well, I'm continuing to sort of pull at the threads of this. They still haven't made meaningful progress on Alexis's case that I'm aware of. I've still been in touch with her a little bit, and the UK media picked up the story and has been kind of like blowing it up in the tabloid press a little bit. So I've been trying to figure out what I could do or what I could write that could try to goad the UK criminal justice system into taking this seriously. I don't know. I honestly am at a bit of a loss for what I could do, but I mean, I'm going to continue to try to push this at least until something is done about this guy. This looking into, who else it could be. If it's not him and they're not worried about it, then let's find somebody else. Like, I think evidence that it is him is pretty compelling. He seems like it warrants closer investigation. So I feel like kind of a little bit at a loss, because as a journalist, as a writer, I've kind of done what I can do. I've written a story and I've sort of gone on Twitter and yelled about it, and maybe the next step is trying to do something a little more explicitly aimed at the law enforcement angle and what could be done and what is not being done. So that's a potential follow-up story that I'm definitely still in touch with all these sources, definitely still in touch with Chris, and I have, for the time being, put away the the wiki itself and I'm not spending time on the murder boards, but it's very much something that I doubt I'll be able to leave behind anytime soon.
Yeah, it sounds like you're in a kind of an interesting place, given that it's very hard to drop, but also kind of needs to be dropped too. I mean, I would think in some way, but like, so like, what else do you do too? I know you are basically managing Terraform. It's a sci-fi publication, right?
Yeah, it's like we do sort of near future speculative fiction kind of stuff that's supposed to sort of contextualize and make resonant sort of themes that are showing up in the science and tech news, which science fiction always does to some extent. But we try to keep it vital and interesting and short form and internet friendly. So yeah, that's one of my hats. I'm also an editor at Medium right now, focusing on sort of um, books coverage, taking a look at science and tech and science fiction and books about the future. As I'm foremost these days an author. I'm working on my second book and have published a book about the iPhone.
Your books are nonfiction, correct?
My books are nonfiction.
Okay. No, I was just curious because I was going to ask, like, have you written about an assassination market yet? But I guess you kind of have. So.
Yeah, I mean, if insofar as there's a story that blurs the lines between fiction and nonfiction and reality and surreality, this Harper's story is the one. We'll see.
Yeah. And then like my other thought with all this too, I didn't really get this sense at all from your piece. I'm also like a bias too because I'm like a journalist, so I get it. But a lot of people when stuff like this comes out, they interpret it as some sort of like story angled to some kind of like scare tactics, like advocacy or something like that. I don't know. But there's that. And then there's also the risk of like taking these people and bringing attention to this stuff and it being interpreted as like manipulative or giving a platform to the wrong kind of people. Like how did you sort of navigate that with this?
Yeah, I mean it's a valid concern, and I think that the considerations were both sort of addressed by me in the fact that like Harper's is kind of a highbrow literary magazine that is mostly read offline. So I doubt that the overlap between aspiring darknet criminals who might use it as inspiration or a case study is pretty small.
Fair enough.
The biggest thing is that there's enough of a worry that we're falling behind in terms of how we address these problems when they creep up, that pretending that they don't exist is not really an option anymore. 2 people have been killed who maybe these deaths could have been prevented. The psychological terror that someone like Alexis lives with because of the actions of somebody taking this hit out online and law enforcement being unable or unwilling to address it is, again, there are dozens and dozens of names on these lists, some of them who are aware that they are on these lists and don't know the parameters of that quote unquote hit, and how serious the person might be. And there are people who are living in fear, there are people who are in danger, and there are people who are dead. So I think that it is something that needs to be examined at this point. You can't just pretend that that these uses of the darknet and of sort of deeply tangentially Bitcoin are not a real problem. I mean, with Bitcoin, it is so tangential. I mean, this could happen without Bitcoin. I don't think Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies are implicated at all in this, nor necessarily the dark web. There are good uses of the dark web that, in protecting whistleblowers, and but we have to be realistic. We have to recognize that like really shitty things are taking place on these platforms, and it's just about figuring out how we deal with them, and just pretending that it's not enough of an issue to warrant spend an hour talking to Alexis and talk about she quit school, she quit jobs, she walks around with a knife in her purse because she didn't know who might be after her. And to say that, like, we should just ignore this threat so that people don't you become interested in it, I think is at this point unfair to the victims who have suffered at its hands already.
Well, Brian, it's been a dark and interesting interview. Thanks for taking all this time out of your afternoon.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and I do hope some of it is interesting, and yeah, the piece is still over at Harper's, so I'd encourage anyone to check it out who's interested. So thanks again for having me. It was a pleasure.
The Bitcoin Magazine podcast is a BTC Media produced podcast on the Let's Talk Bitcoin network. You can find us on Twitter at Bitcoin Magazine, and you can find out about other engaging shows we produce by subscribing to our feed on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.